The glass wall effect. The glass wall effect is a subtle yet remarkably powerful psychological trick that harnesses the quiet strength of observation and silence. This method involves mentally creating an invisible barrier, a transparent but impenetrable glass wall between oneself and others during interactions. By doing so, a silent dynamic emerges, compelling others to reveal deeper truths, motivations, and insecurities without ever uttering a word yourself. The subtlety of this approach is precisely why it's effective. Humans naturally seek connection, validation, and reciprocation, and when those elements are withheld, their subconscious discomfort pushes them toward unexpected honesty. Consider sitting with a friend in a bustling cafe. Your friend is excitedly recounting a recent success, animated and passionate. Instead of responding in your usual engaged manner, you employ the glass wall effect. You remain attentive but quietly detached, refraining from nodding, smiling, or verbally confirming their sentiments. At first, nothing feels unusual. Your friend continues to speak freely, perhaps hardly noticing your shift in demeanor. However, soon the dynamic changes. Your friend begins to stumble slightly over words, glancing repeatedly into your neutral expression, instinctively searching for signs of approval or acknowledgement. Without your usual subtle validations, your friend becomes increasingly vulnerable and genuine, unintentionally revealing uncertainties or hidden emotions they would typically keep buried beneath a facade of confidence. This psychological phenomenon occurs because people instinctively depend upon subtle social cues to sustain their conversational momentum and emotional stability. The glass wall effect strips away these vital affirmations. Without receiving expected reactions, individuals subconsciously sense a break in the social rhythm, prompting them to fill the vacuum by exposing more profound and truthful aspects of themselves. The more you maintain the subtlety and consistency of your silent observation, the more profound the emotional disclosures become. In professional contexts, the glass wall effect becomes particularly fascinating. Picture yourself in a tense boardroom discussion where colleagues passionately debate different ideas. Instead of actively participating, you position yourself quietly behind the metaphorical glass wall, calmly observant, unaffected by the emotional temperature of the room. Gradually, your silence alters the entire dynamic. As arguments ebb and flow, colleagues instinctively look towards you for validation or support, feeling an inexplicable need to win your approval. Without directly challenging anyone, you quietly become the most influential figure in the room, controlling the flow of dialogue and subtly guiding its direction simply by withholding reaction. What makes this trick even more powerful is its dual effect. It not only reveals hidden emotions and truths in others, but also sharpens your observational skills. By stepping back and detaching from emotional engagement, your perception deepens, allowing you to catch minute shifts in facial expressions, body language, and vocal tone, details often missed during active participation. Over time, this heightened perception provides remarkable insight into the underlying motivations and feelings of others, enhancing your interpersonal intelligence and emotional mastery. Ultimately, the glass wall effect serves not merely as a tool of influence but as a profound lesson in human psychology. By mastering the subtle power of intentional silence and neutral observation, you uncover deeper layers of authenticity in interactions. Your ability to quietly influence others and read their subconscious motivations grows steadily, placing you in command without ever speaking a single word. In this way, silence becomes your most powerful voice, and observation your greatest strength. The gentle echo. The gentle echo is a subtle psychological trick built upon the quiet power of imitation. So subtle, in fact, that it often slips beneath conscious awareness entirely. This method involves mirroring another person's subtle gestures, breathing rhythm, or even their pacing of speech, creating a subconscious bond that gradually draws them closer to you. What makes this approach especially intriguing is its invisibility. Those subjected to it rarely detect what's happening consciously, yet their subconscious registers a sense of familiarity and comfort that strongly influences their perception of you. At its heart, the gentle echo operates through human beings' innate tendency to seek connection and validation in social interactions. Our subconscious minds are finely attuned to the subtle rhythms and patterns in those around us. When someone quietly mirrors our own behavior, even in ways we don't consciously notice, our brain registers this imitation as a sign of agreement, alignment, and emotional resonance. As a result, we instinctively feel drawn toward the person performing the subtle echo, perceiving them as trustworthy and empathetic, even without explicitly understanding why. Picture yourself at a social gathering where you've just met a group of new people. You engage in polite small talk, and gradually you identify one individual you'd particularly like to connect with. Instead of overtly attempting to dominate the conversation or impress them through stories, you quietly adopt the gentle echo. If they gently tilt their head while listening, you subtly do the same moments later. If they shift slightly in their seat or pause briefly before speaking, you gently echo these actions, never obviously enough to draw attention, but just enough to synchronize your energy and pace with theirs. As the interaction progresses, something remarkable happens. Without understanding precisely why, the person begins to sense a certain affinity toward you. They feel a deep yet inexplicable comfort, one that feels entirely organic and genuine. They'll find themselves sharing more openly, revealing personal insights or sensitive information they normally keep guarded. Unbeknownst to them, it's the subtle mirroring that has quietly lowered their psychological defenses, creating a warm, safe, subconscious environment. The effectiveness of the gentle echo lies not only in its subtlety, but also in its emotional impact. When someone unconsciously senses they are being mirrored, their subconscious interprets it as validation. This person sees and understands me. The echo resonates softly within them, nurturing feelings of trust and connection. This gentle mirroring also places you in a unique position of quiet authority. Without saying much at all, you've become someone who exerts significant emotional influence over interactions. Imagine you're interviewing for a highly competitive position. You sit across from the hiring manager, feeling the usual tension and anticipation. Rather than relying solely on rehearsed answers, you implement the gentle echo. As the interviewer crosses their legs, you subtly do the same moments later. They lean forward. You echo this subtle movement. Soon, the interviewer feels at ease with you, convinced by an intuition they can't fully articulate. Their subconscious registers you as someone relatable, trustworthy, and comfortably familiar, qualities that are powerful in decision-making scenarios. Yet, what elevates the gentle echo beyond mere manipulation is its foundation in genuine human connection. This trick, when practiced with care and sincerity, fosters authentic emotional bonds. It doesn't create false relationships. It simply accelerates the natural human process of bonding, guiding interactions toward deeper mutual understanding and trust. By mastering the gentle echo, you quietly unlock doors that verbal persuasion often cannot. Your presence alone begins to speak volumes, drawing others gently yet irresistibly toward you, forging subtle connections whose true strength lies in their delicate subconscious resonance. Eye color recall. Eye color recall is an intriguing yet profoundly subtle psychological technique that quietly intensifies the dynamics of any conversation. At its core, the method is deceptively simple. During any interaction, you consciously take note of the other person's eye color. Though it may seem trivial, this small detail creates a powerful and hidden shift in your gaze and presence, one that the subconscious mind of the other person invariably picks up. But why exactly is this simple detail so potent? And how can noticing something as seemingly mundane as eye color profoundly alter human interaction? The power of eye color recall lies in the intensity and depth of gaze it naturally encourages. Most conversations occur with superficial eye contact. Eyes meet briefly, then quickly dart away. This habit maintains comfort but limits emotional connection. However, when you intentionally notice another person's eye color, your gaze automatically becomes slightly more penetrating and deliberate, lingering just long enough to generate a subconscious sense of intimacy. Your conversational partner senses something unusual, perhaps mysterious, about your presence. They feel subtly scrutinized but can't pinpoint why. This uncertainty captures their subconscious attention, compelling them to invest greater emotional energy in the interaction. To illustrate, imagine attending a casual gathering where conversations usually drift toward mundane, predictable topics. You meet someone new and immediately employ the eye color recall technique. The person begins speaking, perhaps describing their recent travels or sharing a story. Instead of passively listening, you consciously identify their eye color. Let's say it's a deep mossy green. By doing so, your gaze automatically becomes focused, creating a subtle yet magnetic intensity in your expression. Your partner subconsciously notices the shift, feeling unusually seen and attended to. The conversation quickly takes on greater emotional depth. They start sharing more personal details, aspirations, or vulnerabilities without fully understanding why they feel compelled to do so. Your simple decision to consciously recall their eye color has fundamentally changed the psychological landscape of the conversation. This effect occurs because human beings subconsciously associate prolonged or intentional eye contact with intimacy, trust, and emotional investment. When your conversational partner feels genuinely seen, even through something as seemingly minor as noticing their eye color, their subconscious mind registers it as meaningful attention. They instinctively perceive you as someone deeply engaged, trustworthy, and intriguing, qualities that foster genuine emotional connections quickly and effortlessly. Consider another example. You're in a critical business meeting and negotiations have become subtly tense. You decide to employ eye color recall with your primary opponent, a manager whose eyes are icy blue. As you deliberately note and recall the shade of their eyes, your gaze shifts, becoming more focused, confident, and penetrating. The manager subconsciously senses your intense attention and begins feeling slightly self-conscious, perhaps uncertain or eager to win your silent approval. Unaware of why they feel this way, they become more amenable, softening their previously rigid stance, subtly shifting the power dynamic in your favor. What elevates eye color recall beyond mere manipulation is the genuine attentiveness it fosters. People spend most conversations barely noticing each other. By deliberately observing something as personal as eye color, you bring genuine depth and presence to your interactions. You see beyond mere words, connecting with the true essence of the person across from you. Over time, this cultivates an aura of emotional intelligence, charisma, and quiet authority that others instinctively sense and admire. Ultimately, eye color recall transforms mundane interactions into deeply engaging psychological exchanges, quietly empowering you to influence, connect, and communicate with extraordinary subtlety. Through the simple act of noticing and recalling a person's eye color, you speak volumes without saying a single word, capturing their subconscious attention and fostering genuine, powerful emotional bonds. False sense of urgency. False sense of urgency is a subtle yet striking psychological trick that quietly harnesses the human brain's instinctual reaction to urgency, triggering an immediate subconscious emotional response. Unlike conventional urgency, where alarm or haste is overtly expressed through clear signals, This method involves carefully crafting a paradoxical dynamic. You communicate calmly and slowly, yet use words and phrases implying urgency, crisis, or imminent consequence. This deliberate contradiction creates a curious, unsettling tension deep within the listener's mind, compelling them into action without fully understanding why. At first glance, urgency might seem straightforward, a loud alarm, hurried speech, or explicit instructions. Yet it's precisely the absence of expected behaviors that makes this trick so potent. When someone calmly expresses an urgent message, it creates an inexplicable, subconscious friction. The listener's mind instinctively expects emotional congruence. Urgent words should come with urgent tones and gestures. When this congruence is missing, the subconscious becomes unsettled, uncertain how to categorize or process the message, and thus becomes irresistibly engaged. To illustrate, imagine you're at work and a colleague quietly approaches your desk. Their voice remains gentle and composed, yet they say calmly, "You might want to check your email right now. It could be very important." There's no explicit panic in their tone, no visible anxiety in their demeanor, just a quiet, assured statement implying urgency. Immediately, your subconscious mind ignites with curiosity and mild anxiety. You feel compelled to act instantly, driven by a vague yet powerful emotional discomfort generated solely by this calm contradiction. You rush to open your inbox, feeling an intense, almost irrational need to resolve the uncertainty created by your colleague's contradictory tone. This psychological technique is deeply rooted in cognitive dissonance, the discomfort the brain experiences when encountering contradictory information. Human minds naturally crave coherence, matching words with matching tone, expressions, and gestures. The false sense of urgency disrupts this coherence subtly and powerfully, leaving the subconscious scrambling for resolution. Because people dislike uncertainty and discomfort, they instinctively seek to resolve this dissonance swiftly, typically by following the implied action or instruction. Consider another scenario. You're selling a product or service. Instead of loudly proclaiming limited time offer or hurry, last chance, you calmly, almost soothingly say, "I would suggest deciding quickly, as this opportunity is quite rare and it might not be available later." Your voice remains unhurried, your expression neutral, even slightly reassuring. Yet the gentle wording of urgency, "deciding quickly, might not be available," quietly sets off alarm bells in your listener's subconscious. They feel drawn into action, convinced internally of the need to respond immediately, even though externally they can't pinpoint why they feel such strong urgency. The genius of this method is its invisibility. Those subjected to it rarely recognize they're being influenced. They perceive your calmness as confidence, sincerity, and authority, yet simultaneously feel a powerful drive to act immediately. This contradiction, calmness masking urgency, is precisely what gives the false sense of urgency its subtle yet powerful effectiveness. Used carefully and ethically, this trick can significantly enhance your persuasive ability, motivating others to act without overt pressure. By mastering the calm delivery of urgent messaging, you subtly yet decisively steer actions and decisions. Over time, this fosters an aura of quiet authority, reliability, and confidence, qualities admired and followed subconsciously. False sense of urgency represents the extraordinary power hidden in subtle contradiction. By calmly harnessing the human subconscious's instinctual reaction to perceived urgency, you quietly yet powerfully influence decisions, actions, and perceptions, turning ordinary communication into subtly compelling psychological experiences. Invisible audience. The invisible audience is an intriguing psychological trick that quietly reshapes the very foundation of human interactions. Unlike more overt methods, this trick does not require explicit communication. gestures, or emotional manipulation. Instead, it rests entirely upon a subtle mental visualization. During any interaction, you simply imagine that a silent, unseen audience is observing the encounter closely, scrutinizing every word and gesture. At first glance, this might sound harmless or insignificant. After all, how could something purely imagined have such a profound psychological impact? Yet beneath its quiet simplicity lies extraordinary power. The strength of the invisible audience technique is rooted in human nature itself. People are naturally sensitive to social dynamics and the opinions of others. The mere presence, or even perceived presence, of additional observers significantly alters behavior, speech, and emotional expression. When you mentally introduce this invisible third-party presence into any interaction, you subconsciously project an air of greater self-awareness, subtle authority, and emotional control. The individuals you're interacting with begin to sense, on a subconscious level, that they're not only communicating with you, but also performing in front of an unseen audience. This creates an internal pressure, a quiet yet powerful emotional tension, pushing them toward honesty, authenticity, or caution they might otherwise avoid. Imagine you're negotiating a delicate business agreement with a partner who has consistently tried to dominate past discussions. Normally, their presence might feel overwhelming or intimidating. This time, however, you consciously invoke the invisible audience trick. As the discussion unfolds, you mentally visualize a silent group of respected colleagues quietly observing the conversation from just beyond sight. Instantly, you find your composure improving, your tone becomes measured, your responses thoughtful, and your body language subtly authoritative. But something even more remarkable happens to your opponent. Without fully understanding why, they become quieter, more careful in their word choice, subconsciously sensing the presence of unseen observers, evaluating their every move. Their attempts at intimidation diminish, replaced by cautious respect. Unknowingly, they've become participants in a psychological performance that you've quietly engineered, guided subtly by the mere suggestion of invisible scrutiny. The phenomenon operates on a deeper subconscious level because the brain automatically adapts its behavior according to perceived social expectations and scrutiny. Studies in psychology show that people behave more ethically, cautiously, and politely when they believe they're being watched, even by imaginary or invisible audiences. By consciously visualizing observers, you project subtle signals of heightened self-awareness, quiet confidence, and elevated emotional control. These signals subconsciously influence those around you, eliciting from them greater honesty, cooperation, and authenticity. Consider another scenario. You're having a difficult personal conversation, perhaps confronting someone who has previously been dismissive or emotionally guarded. Before initiating the discussion, you again mentally summon the invisible audience, a group of respected friends or mentors silently observing your conversation. Instantly, your internal energy shifts. Your demeanor becomes more controlled, compassionate, and authoritative. Subtly sensing this invisible pressure, the other person unconsciously alters their typical response. They begin opening up, revealing deeper truths and vulnerabilities they would usually keep hidden, feeling an inexplicable internal drive to appear genuine and thoughtful under this imagined gaze. The invisible audience trick works precisely because it influences interactions on an invisible psychological plane, bypassing conscious defenses. People respond instinctively to perceived external judgments, even imaginary ones, revealing more authentic versions of themselves and adapting their behavior to align with perceived expectations. This powerful psychological tool quietly transforms human interactions. By mastering the art of visualizing an unseen yet impactful audience, you subtly and effectively guide conversations, inspire honesty, and reshape behaviors. Your invisible spectators become silent collaborators, empowering you to exert profound psychological influence without uttering a single explicit command. Infinite mirror silence. Infinite mirror silence is an extraordinarily potent psychological trick that leverages the quiet yet immense power of strategic silence to subtly but profoundly influence interactions. At first glance, silence may appear passive or neutral, a void in conversation that holds no inherent meaning. But infinite mirror silence transforms silence into an active psychological force, a reflective mirror that silently compels others to speak, reveal hidden truths, or confront internal insecurities. This method involves consciously withholding your response after someone asks a question or makes a statement, patiently holding silence longer than the other person expects or is comfortable with. What makes infinite mirror silence so powerful is precisely the discomfort it creates. Human beings naturally seek to fill conversational voids, instinctively viewing silence as tension or an emotional vacuum that must be resolved. By deliberately withholding a reply, you place the psychological burden squarely upon the other individual. Their subconscious mind urgently seeks resolution and clarity, pushing them to speak further, clarify their intentions, or disclose thoughts they initially wished to conceal. In this way, your silence becomes a reflective mirror, silently prompting deeper self-exposure. To fully understand how effective this trick can be, consider a scenario in which a friend subtly attempts to persuade you into taking on a responsibility you don't want. They casually ask, "You don't mind handling this project for me, right?" Typically, one might hastily agree, pressured by social courtesy or the desire to please. Instead, you employ infinite mirror silence. Rather than responding immediately, you remain silent, calmly looking at them without revealing any reaction. The seconds tick by. Initially, they expect your quick agreement. When it doesn't come, their subconscious feels a subtle anxiety, a pressing uncertainty. They immediately fill this uncomfortable void by nervously explaining themselves, adding more context or justification, often unintentionally revealing their true motives, feelings, or insecurities. Your silent reflection compels them into honest introspection without you uttering a single word. This trick works powerfully because people often underestimate silence's psychological weight. Most individuals subconsciously interpret prolonged silence as judgment, disagreement, or authority, prompting them to instinctively reveal hidden thoughts to gain your approval or clarity. The infinite mirror silence gently leverages this instinctual discomfort, quietly positioning you as an authoritative presence who subtly commands the interaction without active intervention. Another illustration might involve a negotiation scenario. Imagine you're discussing terms of a contract with a client or partner. After stating your conditions, you fall into deliberate silence. Initially, they expect you to continue or concede something, but you remain calmly quiet, patiently allowing silence to envelop the conversation. The other person soon experiences internal discomfort, subconsciously interpreting your silence as firm confidence or subtle dominance. Almost inevitably, they begin to concede additional terms, clarify their stance unnecessarily, or reveal underlying concerns and motivations just to dissolve the tension created by your silence. Your quiet but deliberate refusal to respond immediately exerts remarkable psychological leverage, shifting power dynamics subtly yet decisively in your favor. Infinite mirror silence isn't merely manipulative. It reveals deeper layers of human psychology, demonstrating that silence is often more influential than spoken words. It invites profound authenticity by subtly forcing others to confront their own thoughts, assumptions, and motivations. Over time, mastering this technique deepens your emotional intelligence and conversational mastery, teaching you to harness silence as a strategic asset rather than a passive gap. Infinite mirror silence embodies a paradoxical truth. Sometimes, saying absolutely nothing speaks louder and reveals more than words ever could. By skillfully employing silence as a psychological mirror, you quietly yet profoundly influence interactions, drawing hidden truths effortlessly to the surface. Nonlinear compliments. Nonlinear compliments is a subtly disorienting psychological trick that quietly yet powerfully shapes how others perceive themselves and how they respond to you. Unlike typical praise, which addresses obvious strengths, talents, or achievements, nonlinear compliments deliberately highlight traits or qualities the recipient is unsure about or rarely hears acknowledged. This creates an intriguing internal tension, simultaneously flattering and unsettling, compelling the recipient into deeper introspection and making your words linger far longer than standard praise ever could. At first glance, compliments seem straightforward, a simple acknowledgement of someone's skills, appearance, or accomplishments. Yet the nonlinear compliment defies these expectations by targeting areas of subtle insecurity or rarely recognized qualities. By praising something the person never anticipated, you subtly shake their self-perception, introducing a paradox that captures their subconscious attention. They find themselves intrigued, compelled to reconsider how they view themselves, creating a unique psychological bond with the person who delivered the compliment. Consider a scenario where you're at a social gathering, meeting someone who appears very confident and articulate. This individual likely receives constant affirmation about their speaking skills or charisma. Instead of echoing this predictable praise, you deliver a nonlinear compliment, perhaps remarking softly, "I really admire how thoughtfully you listen when others are talking." Your comment catches them off guard. They're accustomed to recognition for speaking eloquently, not for listening. Internally, they pause, momentarily uncertain. They wonder if they truly are a good listener, feeling a subtle yet powerful need to live up to your observation. Because your compliment was unexpected and uniquely perceptive, they find themselves both flattered and subtly unsettled, engaging with your words long after the conversation ends. The brilliance of nonlinear compliments lies in their ability to resonate deeply within someone's subconscious mind. When praised unexpectedly for a quality they're unsure about, people feel a gentle pressure to validate and embody your words. They subconsciously strive to match your perception, experiencing gratitude toward the person who acknowledged this overlooked trait. Thus, this method quietly shifts power dynamics and establishes a psychological connection that standard praise cannot achieve. Imagine another scenario at work where a colleague, typically praised for their efficiency and analytical skills, suddenly hears from you, "I genuinely admire your calmness under pressure." This remark surprises them. They never consciously considered calmness a particular strength. Internally intrigued, they begin subconsciously reflecting on your compliment, seeking moments when they've demonstrated calmness. They feel subtly obligated, almost motivated, to uphold your perception, even if initially uncertain whether it's entirely accurate. Your nonlinear compliment quietly pushes them toward embodying the positive trait you highlighted, subtly influencing their self-image and future behaviors. Why does this trick work so powerfully? Human psychology naturally seeks external validation to shape self-perception. Compliments usually reinforce what people already know, validating existing self-beliefs. But nonlinear compliments subtly disrupt this pattern, creating a quiet yet compelling cognitive dissonance. Individuals feel simultaneously flattered by your unexpected observation and subtly driven to reconcile their uncertainty about it, making the compliment more psychologically impactful and memorable. However, this trick isn't simply manipulative praise, it fosters genuine self-reflection and growth. By deliberately recognizing overlooked or undervalued qualities, you subtly encourage individuals to explore and embrace aspects of themselves they never previously acknowledged. Over time, this creates a unique psychological bond. Others perceive you as someone insightful, perceptive, and deeply sincere. Nonlinear compliments transform ordinary interactions into powerful psychological exchanges. Through subtle, unexpected praise, you quietly reshape self-perceptions, fostering introspection, gratitude, and deeper emotional connection. Your carefully chosen words linger profoundly within subconscious minds, ensuring your influence continues long after your conversation ends. The peripheral glimpse. The peripheral glimpse is a fascinating psychological technique that quietly expands your observational power by deliberately shifting your attention away from direct eye contact. Rather than engaging head-on with someone, you gently observe them from your peripheral vision, subtly capturing details that direct observation often overlooks. Though it may seem counterintuitive to avoid direct observation, this indirect method grants you deeper, more authentic insights into human behavior, intentions, and emotions. Why does observing through peripheral vision carry such subtle power? The human mind instinctively senses when it's being watched directly, subconsciously triggering defensive mechanisms that alter behavior and mask genuine emotions. However, peripheral observation quietly sidesteps these subconscious defenses, allowing authentic expressions and subtle gestures, often concealed when someone feels directly watched, to reveal themselves naturally. People relax, unconsciously assuming they're not under direct scrutiny, allowing their true feelings, motivations, and hidden reactions to surface clearly in subtle expressions. Consider this scenario. You're in a cafe, meeting a colleague who claims to be fully supportive of your recent promotion. As you discuss your success openly, you employ the peripheral glimpse. While maintaining relaxed eye contact toward your cup of coffee, you gently observe your colleague's face from your peripheral vision. Immediately, subtle, fleeting expressions they would quickly suppress if they felt directly observed, become quietly evident. Perhaps a brief flash of envy crosses their features, a tightening of the lips, or a micro-expression of discomfort. These minute yet revealing reactions, often entirely invisible during direct observation, speak volumes about their true feelings, providing profound subconscious insight into their real emotions and intentions. The true strength of the peripheral glimpse lies in its subtlety. Those being observed peripherally rarely realize they're revealing hidden truths, precisely because they feel safely beyond direct scrutiny. Your indirect focus quietly disarms their subconscious defenses, subtly encouraging authenticity and transparency. Over time, mastering peripheral observation significantly sharpens your emotional intelligence and interpersonal awareness, enabling you to effortlessly understand underlying motivations, concealed insecurities, and suppressed reactions in nearly every interaction. Imagine another scenario where you're negotiating with a potential client who seems outwardly enthusiastic about a deal. While they're speaking, instead of locking eyes directly, you slightly shift your gaze, gently noting their body language from the corners of your eyes. Instantly, subtle signs become apparent: a nervous fidget, tapping fingers, or sudden shifts in posture that betray hidden anxiety, uncertainty, or discomfort. These gestures might never appear if the client felt explicitly observed. By quietly using the peripheral glimpse, you gain valuable subconscious insights into their true feelings, allowing you to navigate the interaction more effectively, strategically addressing hidden concerns they never directly express. This technique draws powerfully upon the psychological principle that human beings instinctively alter their behavior under direct observation. Subconsciously feeling watched, people become guarded, carefully concealing emotions behind socially acceptable masks. Peripheral observation deftly bypasses these instinctual defenses, quietly unlocking deeper truths hidden beneath outward appearances. Through subtle, indirect observation, you capture genuinely unfiltered reactions, small gestures, fleeting expressions, subtle tensions that reveal profound psychological insights otherwise invisible. Moreover, peripheral observation cultivates profound emotional sensitivity and intuitive awareness, teaching you to perceive subtle shifts in energy, emotion, and intention that direct observation frequently misses. Over time, you develop a refined psychological understanding, intuitively reading interactions with extraordinary subtlety and precision. The peripheral glimpse quietly transforms ordinary observation into powerful psychological insight. By shifting your gaze slightly away from direct eye contact, you unlock deeper authenticity in every interaction, capturing subtle subconscious truths that others unknowingly reveal. Your ability to perceive hidden motivations and genuine emotions becomes a silent yet profoundly influential force, subtly guiding every interaction without anyone ever noticing your quiet, powerful observation. Pattern breaker. Pattern breaker is a quietly powerful psychological technique that masterfully disrupts predictable conversational patterns, subtly shifting the power dynamic and capturing intense subconscious attention. At its core, this trick involves intentionally changing your tone, pacing, or demeanor abruptly mid-conversation, instantly creating a disorienting but intriguing psychological pause. Though simple in concept, pattern breaker carries significant influence precisely because human minds crave consistency, clarity, and predictability in interactions. Any sudden deviation from expected behavior immediately unsettles the subconscious, creating a momentary state of openness, confusion, and vulnerability, a state ripe for subtle influence. To fully grasp pattern breakers' remarkable power, consider why human interactions typically rely on familiar patterns. Conversations usually proceed predictably, anchored by a stable rhythm, questions followed by answers, statements eliciting agreement, emotional tone remaining consistent. Our subconscious brains feel safe and comfortable within these predictable frameworks. But when this consistency is abruptly disrupted, the subconscious mind experiences instant discomfort and heightened alertness, urgently seeking resolution or understanding. During this brief yet potent psychological gap, individuals become particularly susceptible to influence, suggestion, and emotional reshaping. Imagine sitting across from someone in an everyday conversation, perhaps a coworker, confidently discussing a familiar topic. Your interaction proceeds normally, relaxed, predictable, comfortable. Suddenly, you employ the pattern breaker. Without warning, your voice shifts dramatically, perhaps dropping into a softer, slower tone, or speeding up sharply in pace. Maybe you pause abruptly mid-sentence, leaving a thought incomplete. Immediately, the other person's subconscious becomes acutely aware of this unexpected deviation. Internally startled and mildly confused, their mind races to interpret the sudden change. Why did your tone shift? Did they misunderstand something? Were you subtly correcting or questioning their statements? In this brief window of heightened alertness and uncertainty, you quietly gain extraordinary psychological leverage. Consider a more specific example: a salesperson delivering a well-rehearsed pitch. Initially, their presentation flows predictably, establishing comfort and familiarity. Midway through, they suddenly lower their voice dramatically, leaning forward and saying softly, "Actually, let me share something completely different with you." The listener's subconscious immediately snaps to full attention. The sudden break in pattern shatters the listener's comfortable expectations, creating deep internal intrigue and emotional openness. They lean in instinctively, subconsciously eager to resolve the unexpected disruption, rendering them significantly more receptive to what comes next. This trick, applied carefully, subtly transforms passive listeners into active participants, deeply attentive, emotionally responsive, and subtly persuaded. The effectiveness of pattern breaker arises from its inherent psychological contradiction. Humans instinctively seek coherence, consistency, and predictable emotional rhythms in social interactions. When these expectations are suddenly broken, the subconscious feels momentarily lost and uncertain, instinctively craving clarity and guidance. This quiet psychological tension provides a remarkable opportunity for subtle emotional influence. Precisely because pattern breaker leverages subconscious discomfort, those affected rarely detect its presence consciously. Instead, they perceive you as someone uniquely engaging, intriguing, or unpredictably charismatic, without consciously understanding why they feel drawn toward your presence. Yet, beyond mere manipulation, pattern breaker genuinely deepens interpersonal connections, transforming interactions from mundane to memorable. By occasionally disrupting predictability, conversations gain emotional intensity, authentic spontaneity, and psychological richness that predictable interactions rarely achieve. People remember and gravitate toward individuals who provide novel emotional experiences, precisely because unexpected psychological disruption sparks powerful curiosity, openness, and emotional engagement. Pattern breaker quietly revolutionizes ordinary interactions. By deliberately breaking conversational patterns, you subtly yet powerfully influence subconscious attention, emotional receptivity, and interpersonal dynamics. Conversations become deeply engaging psychological experiences, granting you extraordinary subtlety and emotional authority, guiding interactions gently yet profoundly toward your desired outcomes. Clockwork Gaze. Clockwork Gaze is a quietly compelling psychological trick that leverages the simple act of glancing briefly at a watch or clock during a conversation to subtly influence the perception and behavior of others. Although it appears innocuous and ordinary at first glance, this discreet gesture carries remarkable psychological influence, silently reshaping interactions by instilling a subconscious sense of urgency or importance. The subtlety of the clockwork gaze lies precisely in its normalcy. A quick glance at a watch seems entirely innocent, yet it triggers deep psychological reactions beneath the surface. Why does such a tiny gesture yield profound psychological effects? Human beings are naturally attuned to subtle signals related to time. In social interactions, timing strongly influences emotions, perceptions, and subconscious judgments. When you glance briefly at your watch during a conversation, the other person's subconscious mind automatically interprets the gesture as an indication of urgency, importance, or limited availability, even if you never explicitly say anything about being rushed or needing to leave. This subconscious interpretation silently alters their emotional state, compelling them to accelerate their speech, clarify their points quickly, or disclose important information more readily than they otherwise might. Imagine a scenario where a colleague is delivering a prolonged and somewhat redundant presentation, seemingly unaware of the audience's waning interest. Rather than verbally interrupting or openly expressing impatience, actions that could appear rude or aggressive, you gently employ clockwork gaze. Midway through their presentation, you casually yet purposefully glance at your watch for just a brief moment. Without uttering a single word, your subtle gesture quietly conveys subconscious urgency and signals importance of time. The presenter's subconscious mind immediately registers your glance, instinctively interpreting it as a gentle yet powerful reminder of time constraints or waning attention. Almost unconsciously, they begin speeding up, sharpening their points, or concluding their remarks more swiftly, all without consciously realizing they're doing so, simply in response to your quiet, unobtrusive psychological cue. The extraordinary subtlety of clockwork gaze is precisely why it's so effective. Those influenced by it rarely notice They're responding to a subtle signal, believing instead they independently chose to accelerate or clarify their speech. In reality, your quick glance acted as a silent, emotional prompt, subtly steering the interaction without any explicit confrontation or direct intervention. This quiet yet powerful influence significantly reshapes conversational dynamics, granting you subtle control over pacing, clarity, and depth. Consider another example. During an interview or negotiation, you're conversing with someone who tends to become overly verbose or evasive. Rather than confronting or explicitly challenging their behavior, you simply glance briefly at your watch during a crucial moment of their speech. The other person subconsciously notices your action, quietly interpreting it as a sign that their time or explanation is running thin. Immediately, their subconscious responds by becoming clearer, more direct, or even slightly apologetic, subtly shifting power dynamics quietly in your favor. Moreover, beyond merely controlling conversation timing, Clockwork Gaze also positions you subtly as someone whose time and attention carry great value. People naturally respect individuals who appear mindful of their own schedules and priorities. Your brief yet deliberate gesture communicates, without words, that you hold yourself and your time in high regard. This quietly elevates your perceived status, authority, and self-respect, prompting others subconsciously to respect your presence and boundaries more profoundly. Clockwork Gaze demonstrates the extraordinary influence of subtlety and timing in psychological interaction. By mastering this seemingly simple gesture, briefly checking your watch, you quietly and powerfully reshape conversations, influencing subconscious perceptions, behaviors, and respect. Through subtle control over time awareness, you silently command interactions, influencing outcomes without ever needing to openly express authority or urgency. Open loop statements. Open loop statements represent one of the most subtly compelling psychological techniques that quietly captures and maintains human attention, compelling the subconscious mind into a state of curiosity and emotional investment. Unlike clear, straightforward communication, this approach deliberately leaves crucial details unresolved, offering only partial information that sparks subconscious intrigue. The listener instinctively craves resolution, explanation, or closure, yet receives none. This creates an extraordinary psychological tension, a quiet yet powerful emotional itch that demands satisfaction. The brilliance of the open loop statement lies precisely in its incompleteness. It quietly embeds itself in the listener's mind, prompting persistent subconscious reflection long after the conversation has ended. Why do open loop statements hold such profound psychological power? The human brain is innately wired to seek clarity, resolution, and completion. When confronted with uncertainty or incompleteness, subconscious processes immediately activate, urging the mind toward resolution. This psychological effect, often referred to as the Zeigarnik effect, is precisely what makes unresolved statements linger persistently within one's thoughts. People subconsciously replay incomplete loops repeatedly, internally attempting to resolve the tension created by the lack of clarity. Consider a simple yet illustrative example. You're chatting casually with a friend or colleague, and in passing, you quietly say something intriguing yet deliberately vague, such as, "That reminds me of something unusual I learned about you recently, but perhaps now isn't the right moment." Your friend immediately feels subtle internal discomfort and curiosity, their subconscious instinctively desperate for clarity. What exactly did you discover? Was it positive or negative? Why did you withhold further details? Long after your conversation ends, your friend finds their mind repeatedly returning to your subtle yet unresolved statement, subconsciously analyzing every interaction, trying to guess or deduce precisely what you might know. The potency of open-loop statements lies not merely in temporary curiosity, but in their ability to persistently occupy subconscious thought. Because the human mind naturally dislikes unresolved mysteries, these statements linger powerfully within one's subconscious, ensuring your presence quietly remains influential well beyond the initial conversation. In future interactions, the recipient feels subconsciously compelled to resolve the previously established uncertainty, often becoming more emotionally open, cooperative, or eager to please, all to subtly encourage you toward revealing withheld details. Imagine another scenario. During an important business meeting or negotiation, you casually mention, "There's something crucial that may significantly impact our strategy moving forward, but I'll bring it up at a later time." Instantly, your subtle yet unresolved remark captivates attention, compelling listeners into quiet internal speculation. What could be crucial enough to impact strategies significantly? Why withhold this information now? Internally unsettled, participants become deeply attentive, subconsciously eager to ensure future conversations or negotiations occur, simply to resolve your deliberately open loop. Your incomplete yet intriguing statement quietly grants you considerable influence, subtly motivating listeners to accommodate your future requests or positions, all in subconscious pursuit of clarity. Yet, open-loop statements aren't merely manipulative, they're also profoundly insightful. By carefully noting what information others subconsciously crave most eagerly, you gain remarkable psychological understanding of their true motivations, insecurities, and emotional priorities. Moreover, this technique subtly positions you as someone intriguing, insightful, and uniquely captivating, quietly enhancing your interpersonal charisma and persuasive influence. Open-loop statements masterfully leverage subconscious psychology, quietly transforming simple conversations into powerful interactions filled with emotional intrigue and psychological depth. By skillfully withholding crucial information, you subtly yet decisively capture attention, maintain subconscious engagement, and exert remarkable long-term influence. Conversations become rich psychological landscapes filled with quiet tension, profound intrigue, and subtle yet persistent emotional connections that last long beyond their initial moment. Deliberate contradiction. Deliberate contradiction is an elegantly subtle psychological trick that gently disrupts conversational patterns and quietly unsettles subconscious assumptions. Unlike outright disagreements or confrontational challenges, this method involves intentionally introducing minor, subtle contradictions in otherwise agreeable interactions. Though initially appearing trivial or harmless, these tiny contradictions carry powerful psychological weight, quietly capturing attention, provoking deeper thought, and compelling others to subconsciously reconsider their positions, beliefs, or assumptions. Why does such a subtle act of contradiction hold profound psychological power? Human minds naturally seek conversational harmony, coherence, and consistency, especially during interactions they consider safe or predictable. When someone unexpectedly contradicts minor details, particularly when done gently, without hostility or overt aggression, it creates a small yet powerful subconscious friction. The recipient's subconscious mind immediately seeks resolution and clarity. Did they misunderstand something? Why did you contradict them? Are they mistaken about other things too? This quiet yet potent uncertainty subtly motivates introspection and emotional openness, compelling the other person to subconsciously reconsider their original beliefs or positions. Imagine you're having a friendly discussion with someone confident in their opinion, perhaps a coworker enthusiastically proposing a new project idea. Instead of openly disagreeing, you gently introduce a subtle contradiction. For example, When they assert confidently, "This approach always works flawlessly," you calmly and softly reply, "Well, maybe not always flawlessly, though it definitely has strengths." Your mild contradiction seems innocuous, but it subtly unsettles their subconscious confidence. They pause internally, feeling quietly compelled to reconsider their overly certain assertion. Without fully understanding why, they begin subtly re-evaluating their proposal, acknowledging hidden weaknesses or limitations they previously ignored. The beauty of deliberate contradiction lies precisely in its subtlety and gentle delivery. Overt contradictions often trigger defensiveness, hostility, or emotional resistance. However, quiet, minor contradictions bypass these conscious defenses, influencing the subconscious gently yet decisively. Those subjected to such contradictions rarely feel directly challenged or disrespected. Instead, they perceive you as someone insightful, thoughtful, and quietly perceptive. Your subtle contradictions become psychological nudges, gently guiding others toward deeper introspection, emotional openness, or subconscious agreement. Consider another scenario. During a negotiation, someone repeatedly emphasizes their position's supposed fairness. Rather than openly contesting them, you subtly introduce deliberate contradictions, gently remarking, "I understand your point about fairness, although from another perspective, fairness might look different." Your subtle contradiction gently shifts the psychological dynamic, compelling the other person to subconsciously question and reevaluate their initial stance. Internally unsettled, yet not openly confronted, they subconsciously become more receptive to alternative views, subtly reshaping the negotiation toward mutual compromise and understanding. Moreover, deliberate contradiction subtly positions you as someone uniquely thoughtful and quietly confident. Because your contradictions are gentle, minor, and thoughtful, others perceive you as intellectually careful and emotionally balanced, not combative or confrontational. Over time, people subconsciously begin seeking your subtle approval or perspective precisely because your contradictions compel deeper psychological insight and self-awareness. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, deliberate contradiction genuinely enriches interactions, fostering intellectual curiosity, emotional authenticity, and thoughtful self-reflection. By quietly disrupting predictable patterns of agreement, conversations become psychologically deeper, emotionally richer, and profoundly engaging. Interactions shift from superficial pleasantries to authentic explorations of differing perspectives and nuanced truths. Deliberate contradiction embodies extraordinary psychological subtlety, gently yet decisively disrupting subconscious assumptions and conversational complacency. Through minor, thoughtful contradictions delivered softly and subtly, you quietly reshape perceptions, provoke introspection, and foster emotional openness. Conversations become psychologically engaging interactions, filled with quiet intrigue, thoughtful reflection, and profound yet subtle influence that gently guides others toward deeper self-awareness and genuine emotional connection. Spatial control. Spatial control is a subtle yet remarkably influential psychological trick rooted in the strategic manipulation of physical space during interactions. At its core, this technique involves deliberately adjusting your proximity and positioning relative to others, quietly reshaping subconscious perceptions of authority, intimacy, and dominance. While most people rarely consider how physical spacing affects their psychological experiences, subtle shifts in spatial dynamics carry profound emotional impact, silently influencing feelings, behavior, and interpersonal power dynamics. What makes spatial control particularly intriguing is precisely its quiet invisibility. Unlike verbal persuasion or overt gestures, spatial adjustments are often subconscious, rarely noticed explicitly by those involved. Yet beneath this subtlety lies extraordinary power. humans instinctively associate certain spatial arrangements with feelings of control, dominance, or intimacy. By consciously managing your physical positioning, whether subtly stepping closer, creating distance, or shifting positions, you quietly trigger subconscious emotional responses, silently reshaping perceptions and reactions without ever saying a single explicit word. To truly understand spatial control's psychological potency, imagine a scenario in which you're engaging in a tense conversation with someone accustomed to dominating interactions. Initially, they position themselves confidently, perhaps directly across from you, subtly exerting dominance through spatial arrangement. Instead of verbally challenging or confronting them, you quietly exercise spatial control. Gradually, without obvious confrontation, you subtly reposition yourself, perhaps stepping slightly closer, leaning forward slightly, or subtly shifting your angle. Instantly, the other person's subconscious senses this minor spatial shift. Internally unsettled, their subconscious mind registers your quiet assertion of dominance, authority, or confidence, triggering subtle feelings of uncertainty, vulnerability, or subconscious respect. Without fully realizing why, their behavior begins subtly changing. They soften their tone, become more cooperative, or unconsciously defer to your perspectives. Your quiet yet deliberate manipulation of space silently shifts subconscious perceptions, gently granting you emotional leverage and authority. Why does such subtle spatial repositioning yield profound psychological outcomes? Human beings naturally perceive physical proximity and positioning as subconscious signals of emotional intention and social hierarchy. Stepping slightly closer typically indicates intimacy, confidence, or dominance. Subtle withdrawal often signals emotional caution, disengagement, or uncertainty. Adjusting angles or positioning yourself above eye level quietly signals subconscious authority or superiority. These subconscious interpretations profoundly influence emotional experiences, shaping feelings of comfort, anxiety, respect, or vulnerability in subtle yet powerful ways. Imagine another scenario. You're delivering an important presentation to colleagues or clients. Initially, your audience subconsciously perceives themselves in control, comfortably observing your presentation from a secure distance. However, you gradually employ spatial control. Slowly, subtly, and without apparent intent, you step incrementally closer, shifting slightly to engage directly with individual listeners. Your subconscious audience immediately senses your quiet, yet purposeful proximity shift. Internally, they feel subtle emotional pressure, suddenly less anonymous, slightly uncomfortable, quietly compelled to pay greater attention and respond more positively to your presentation. Without consciously realizing why, your subtle spatial manipulation silently elevates your perceived authority, engagement, and confidence, dramatically reshaping subconscious receptivity and responsiveness. Moreover, spatial control subtly yet powerfully reshapes interpersonal perceptions. Individuals unconsciously respect and trust those who manage physical space confidently and purposefully. Your quiet mastery of spatial dynamics silently conveys subconscious signals of authority, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal skill. Over time, these subtle cues foster deeper emotional connections, increase respect, and subconscious trust, significantly enhancing your interpersonal effectiveness. Spatial control represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious perceptions of physical space to profoundly influence emotional experiences and interpersonal dynamics. By mastering subtle spatial shifts, you silently yet decisively assert authority, foster intimacy, or compel emotional responsiveness, transforming ordinary interactions into powerful psychological exchanges filled with quiet influence and emotional depth. The lost word is an exceptionally subtle yet psychologically powerful trick, artfully using the appearance of momentary forgetfulness to deeply engage and subtly influence others. At first glance, this approach seems innocuous, simply pausing briefly during a conversation as though you've momentarily forgotten a particular word or phrase. Yet beneath this simple gesture lies an extraordinary power. The human subconscious instinctively feels compelled to fill conversational gaps, provide clarity, and resolve uncertainty. By deliberately introducing a moment of minor controlled confusion, pretending that you've temporarily lost a word, you quietly but decisively shift emotional engagement, subconscious focus, and interpersonal dynamics in your favor. Why does something as simple as briefly forgetting a word hold such profound psychological influence? Human beings instinctively crave resolution, clarity, and conversational harmony. Any momentary uncertainty, such as a briefly forgotten word, creates subconscious discomfort, compelling the listener to quickly intervene, assist, or clarify. In their subconscious eagerness to restore conversational flow, people subconsciously become emotionally invested, deeply attentive, and subtly cooperative, qualities that significantly enhance your quiet interpersonal influence. Imagine a scenario in which you're explaining an important point during a meeting or presentation. Rather than speaking fluently and confidently throughout, you deliberately pause briefly, softly furrowing your brows as if genuinely struggling to recall a specific word. Perhaps you say something like, "It's important because this creates," what's the word? Instantly, your audience's subconscious minds become acutely engaged, internally compelled by the subtle tension of your brief confusion. Someone almost inevitably volunteers the missing word or eagerly attempts to help clarify your thoughts. Without realizing it, they've subconsciously shifted from passive listeners to active, emotionally invested participants, deeply attentive, personally involved, and subconsciously supportive of your points. The quiet brilliance of the lost word trick lies precisely in this subtle yet powerful shift from passive observation to active emotional engagement. Rather than simply listening neutrally, individuals feel subconsciously compelled to participate actively, subtly bonding with you emotionally through their eagerness to help resolve your minor conversational struggle. Their subconscious perception shifts from distant neutrality to quiet empathy, emotional alignment, and interpersonal support, all because of your deliberate momentary forgetfulness. Consider another scenario. During a negotiation or interpersonal discussion, you gently pause, appearing genuinely thoughtful yet slightly uncertain. You might softly say, "It's crucial because of," I'm looking for the right word. Immediately, your conversational partner subconsciously senses subtle vulnerability, uncertainty, or emotional openness. Internally compelled by subconscious empathy and the instinctive desire for conversational clarity, they instinctively offer assistance, suggesting words, clarifications, or resolutions. Without realizing it, they subtly yet significantly alter their subconscious perception, emotionally aligning themselves more closely with your perspectives, subtly shifting interpersonal dynamics and emotional bonds quietly in your favor. Yet, beyond mere conversational control, the lost word genuinely enriches interpersonal exchanges, fostering emotional authenticity, active empathy, and genuine engagement. By occasionally introducing subtle uncertainty or vulnerability, briefly forgetting a word, you quietly invite others into deeper emotional connections, authentic participation, and subconscious alignment. Conversations shift from predictable, superficial interactions into emotionally resonant exchanges filled with subconscious support, mutual empathy, and subtle yet profound emotional bonding. Moreover, the lost word trick quietly enhances perceptions of your authenticity, humility, and emotional relatability. Individuals instinctively trust and respect those who occasionally reveal subtle vulnerability, genuine reflection, or emotional openness. Your deliberate moment of minor confusion subtly humanizes you, quietly fostering deeper emotional connections, subconscious respect, and genuine interpersonal trust. Ultimately, the lost word represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing the subconscious human instinct for conversational clarity and emotional harmony. By skillfully introducing brief, controlled moments of forgetfulness, you subtly yet decisively capture emotional attention, enhance interpersonal bonding, and shift subconscious dynamics in your favor, transforming ordinary conversations into profoundly engaging psychological experiences. Unfinished movement. Unfinished movement is an exceptionally subtle yet psychologically captivating technique that quietly leverages the power of incomplete gestures or actions to capture subconscious attention and emotional engagement. At its core, this trick involves initiating a physical movement, such as reaching for something, adjusting posture, or beginning a gesture, yet deliberately stopping short, leaving the action unresolved. While seemingly minor, this small interruption creates a quiet yet powerful psychological tension within observers, compelling their subconscious minds to remain subtly yet intensely focused on you, awaiting the gesture's completion. Why does something as minor as an unfinished gesture carry profound psychological impact? Human brains are naturally attuned to observing, interpreting, and predicting the behaviors of others. When someone begins a gesture, subconscious minds instinctively anticipate its completion, unconsciously tracking movements and predicting outcomes. By deliberately interrupting a gesture midway, leaving movements subtly unresolved, you quietly create subconscious curiosity, tension, and emotional openness. People feel subtly compelled to remain attentive, quietly wondering when and how you'll complete the interrupted action, their subconscious minds quietly captivated by the unresolved psychological tension you've created. Imagine you're conversing casually with a friend or colleague. Midway through the interaction, you casually reach for your coffee mug, slowly lifting your hand, only to stop midway, quietly resting your hand lightly in mid-air without completing the action. At first glance, this seems trivial or accidental, yet subconsciously, your friend's mind instantly registers the unresolved gesture, quietly feeling subtle psychological discomfort and subconscious curiosity. Internally compelled by instinctive anticipation, they subtly remain more deeply engaged, attentively observing you, subconsciously awaiting gesture completion, even though consciously unaware of their psychological captivation. Your minor unfinished gesture quietly yet profoundly enhances their subconscious emotional investment, attention, and responsiveness, subtly yet powerfully influencing interpersonal dynamics. Consider another scenario. During a professional meeting, you're explaining an important point, casually beginning to adjust your sleeve or tie. Rather than completing the adjustment immediately, you quietly pause mid-gesture, hand lingering gently in mid-motion while continuing to speak calmly. Instantly, your audience subconsciously senses the unresolved action, internally compelled by quiet psychological tension to remain deeply attentive. Without consciously understanding why, they subtly yet significantly increase their subconscious emotional investment. Quietly focus on your words, behaviors, and subtle cues. Your deliberate, unfinished movement silently commands their subconscious attention, compelling deeper emotional engagement, psychological openness, and interpersonal influence, all through subtle, incomplete gestures. The psychological power of unfinished movement arises precisely from its inherent subtlety and incompleteness. Humans instinctively crave closure, resolution, and completion. Any action left subtly unresolved, quietly yet powerfully, captures subconscious attention, compelling emotional openness and engagement. Moreover, because unfinished gestures appear natural, casual, or accidental, observers rarely detect conscious manipulation, perceiving you instead as naturally intriguing, quietly charismatic, or subtly captivating. Yet, beyond mere psychological manipulation, unfinished movement genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper subconscious attention, emotional curiosity, and psychological intrigue. By occasionally leaving gestures unresolved, you quietly invite others into heightened emotional awareness, subtle psychological bonding, and genuine interpersonal attentiveness. Conversations shift from predictable routine into subtly captivating psychological experiences filled with quiet emotional resonance and subconscious intrigue. Furthermore, unfinished movement subtly yet profoundly enhances perceptions of your presence, charisma, and psychological depth. Individuals instinctively feel intrigued and quietly fascinated by those who subtly defy predictable patterns, leaving actions unresolved or subtly incomplete. Over time, your quiet mastery of unfinished gestures fosters subconscious admiration, emotional engagement, and interpersonal respect, quietly enhancing your psychological influence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Unfinished movement represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing human instinct for resolution and psychological curiosity. By skillfully interrupting gestures or movements midway, leaving them subtly incomplete, you quietly yet decisively command subconscious attention, emotional engagement, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary interactions into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet intrigue and subtle emotional power. Echoed confirmation. Echoed confirmation is a quietly powerful psychological trick that subtly challenges someone's confidence by gently reflecting their own statements back to them as questions. Unlike direct disagreements or overt confrontations, this method appears innocuous, almost supportive, yet beneath its simple facade lies extraordinary psychological depth. At its core, echoed confirmation involves softly repeating another person's statement, adding a questioning intonation or mild uncertainty, effectively turning their confident assertion into a subtle, reflective question. This tiny shift quietly unsettles their subconscious confidence, compelling them to internally reconsider, clarify, or justify their original statement. Why does something as minor as echoing a statement as a question carry profound psychological power? Human beings instinctively rely on external validation and subconscious affirmation during interactions. When someone confidently makes a statement, they subconsciously expect affirmation, agreement, or passive acceptance. Echoing their statement back as a subtle question disrupts this subconscious expectation, quietly introducing subtle uncertainty, self-doubt, or psychological discomfort. Instantly, the individual subconsciously feels compelled to internally review, clarify, or defend their statement, silently shifting interpersonal dynamics in your favor. Consider a casual conversation where a friend or colleague confidently asserts an opinion, perhaps saying, "This approach is definitely the best one." Rather than directly challenging or openly disagreeing, you softly employ echoed confirmation, gently repeating their statement as a subtle, reflective question. "This approach is definitely the best one?" Your quiet yet purposeful reflection creates a subconscious moment of subtle uncertainty and introspection within your conversational partner. Internally unsettled, they instinctively pause, quietly reconsidering their confident assertion, subconsciously seeking to clarify or justify their reasoning. Without realizing it, they've subtly shifted from confident certainty to quiet introspection and emotional openness, gently influenced by your seemingly harmless echoed question. The true psychological power of echoed confirmation lies precisely in its subtlety and gentle delivery. Overt challenges or confrontations frequently trigger defensiveness, resistance, or emotional hostility. However, quiet reflections, merely echoing statements as subtle questions, bypass conscious defenses, subtly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional openness, and self-awareness. Those subjected to echoed confirmations rarely perceive direct manipulation, instead viewing you as naturally thoughtful, quietly insightful, and subtly intriguing. Your gentle reflections quietly yet decisively shift interpersonal dynamics, emotional responsiveness, and subconscious openness without provoking conscious resistance. Imagine another scenario during a professional negotiation or important discussion. Someone confidently presents a firm position, asserting, "This pricing structure is fair and balanced." Rather than overtly disagreeing, you gently reflect their statement back, softly repeating with questioning intonation, "This pricing structure is fair and balanced?" Immediately, the other person's subconscious senses your subtle uncertainty, quietly feeling internally compelled to reconsider, clarify, or justify their position. Internally unsettled, yet subconsciously open, they subtly shift toward emotional openness, cooperation, or compromise, all quietly influenced by your gentle echoed reflection. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, echoed confirmation genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and thoughtful self-reflection. By quietly prompting individuals to reconsider confident assertions, conversations become subtly engaging psychological experiences filled with emotional depth, subconscious curiosity, and quiet introspection. Your gentle reflections subtly guide individuals toward deeper self-awareness, genuine emotional openness, and authentic interpersonal connections. Furthermore, echoed confirmation subtly enhances perceptions of your emotional intelligence, interpersonal skill, and thoughtful presence. Individuals instinctively respect and trust those who gently prompt deeper introspection, emotional authenticity, and thoughtful reflection. Over time, your quiet mastery of echoed reflections fosters deeper subconscious trust, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, subtly yet profoundly enhancing your psychological presence and subtle charisma. Echoed confirmation represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for validation and emotional certainty. By skillfully echoing statements as subtle reflective questions, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious confidence, emotional openness, and interpersonal dynamics, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet influence, emotional introspection, and genuine interpersonal connection. Randomly shift attention. Randomly shift attention is a subtle yet deeply powerful psychological technique that masterfully leverages unexpected shifts in your focus to quietly influence interactions. Rather than maintaining steady eye contact or consistent focus throughout a conversation, this trick involves gently and unpredictably diverting your gaze or attention towards something seemingly unrelated, briefly glancing elsewhere, momentarily examining a random object, or subtly changing the direction of your attention without explanation. Though appearing casual or inconsequential at first glance, these subtle attention shifts carry profound subconscious influence, quietly unsettling conversational partners and compelling deeper emotional engagement, introspection, and responsiveness. Why does something as minor as momentarily diverting your gaze have significant psychological impact? Humans naturally seek validation, consistency, and predictable engagement during interactions. When speaking, individuals subconsciously expect attentive focus and steady engagement from listeners. Any unexpected shift in attention, even subtly or briefly creates subconscious uncertainty, quietly signaling emotional disengagement, subtle judgment, or mild disapproval. Internally unsettled, individuals instinctively feel compelled to subconsciously seek your attention, approval, or validation, subtly altering their behavior, emotional openness, or interpersonal responsiveness. Imagine a casual conversation with a friend describing their recent achievements. Typically, they expect steady, validating attention, sustained eye contact, supportive nods, or subtle affirmations. Instead, you gently employ randomly shift attention. Midway through their confident explanation, you subtly yet deliberately glance elsewhere, perhaps briefly observing something across the room or momentarily focusing on your watch. Your subtle attention shift instantly unsettles their subconscious confidence. Internally uncertain, they subtly wonder, did you become bored? Were you distracted by something more important? Quietly unsettled, their subconscious compels them toward deeper emotional openness, clarity, or introspection, unconsciously striving to regain your attention, validation, and subtle approval. The psychological brilliance of randomly shift attention lies precisely in its subtle unpredictability. Overt disengagement or explicit distraction usually triggers conscious offense, hostility, or emotional defensiveness. However, gentle, brief, and seemingly innocent attention shifts bypass these conscious defenses, subtly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responses, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to random attention shifts rarely detect overt manipulation, instead perceiving you as naturally intriguing, subtly unpredictable, and quietly charismatic, unconsciously striving to engage your subtle yet compelling psychological presence. Consider another scenario during a professional interaction, such as a negotiation or important meeting. While someone confidently presents their points, you casually yet deliberately shift attention unpredictably, briefly checking notes, momentarily glancing toward a window, or subtly observing your pen. Instantly, the other person's subconscious registers your subtle disengagement, internally compelled towards subtle emotional vulnerability, clarity, or introspection. Without consciously realizing why, their subconscious seeks to regain your emotional engagement, subtly shifting toward cooperative openness, genuine emotional clarity, or subconscious alignment, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological cue. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, randomly shift attention genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and subconscious engagement. By occasionally introducing subtle attention shifts, conversations become quietly intriguing psychological experiences filled with subconscious curiosity, emotional depth, and genuine introspection. Your subtle yet deliberate unpredictability quietly invites others into deeper emotional awareness, subconscious openness, and genuine interpersonal connection, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally resonant exchanges. Furthermore, randomly shift attention subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively feel intrigued and quietly fascinated by subtle unpredictability, viewing you as uniquely compelling, emotionally complex, and quietly influential. Over time, your mastery of subtle attention shifts fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional engagement, and interpersonal influence, quietly yet profoundly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Randomly, shift attention represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for validation, emotional engagement, and interpersonal responsiveness. By skillfully and unpredictably diverting attention briefly, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary interactions into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet influence, emotional depth, and genuine interpersonal connection. Delayed response. Delayed response is a profoundly subtle psychological trick that quietly leverages strategic pauses in conversation to create powerful subconscious influence. Unlike immediate instinctive replies that maintain predictable conversational rhythm, this method involves deliberately delaying your response, holding silence briefly after someone asks a question or makes a statement. While initially seeming innocuous, this small hesitation carries extraordinary psychological weight, quietly unsettling subconscious expectations, increasing anticipation, and compelling deeper emotional engagement, introspection, and responsiveness from the other person. Why does something as minor as a delayed reply possess such powerful psychological influence? Human beings naturally crave predictable conversational rhythm, subconscious validation, and emotional harmony during interactions. When someone asks a question or makes a confident statement, they subconsciously expect immediate emotional affirmation, validation, or engagement. Any brief delay in responding, even subtly or innocently, creates subconscious tension, quiet uncertainty, and emotional discomfort. Internally, unsettled by your silence, individuals instinctively feel compelled to subconsciously reevaluate, clarify, or emotionally invest more deeply, unconsciously striving to resolve subtle psychological tension your delay quietly created. Imagine you're engaging in casual conversation with a friend, confidently sharing an opinion or asking your perspective on a sensitive issue. Typically, they'd expect immediate validation or response, subconsciously anticipating conversational harmony. Instead, you gently employ delayed response. After they finish speaking, you quietly hold silence for just a brief moment longer than usual, allowing the pause to gently hang in the air. Initially subtle, your delayed reply instantly unsettles subconscious expectations, compelling your friend to internally reconsider, clarify, or reevaluate their words. Internally uncertain, they subconsciously feel emotionally vulnerable, quietly wondering if your hesitation signals mild disagreement, confusion, or emotional judgment. Without consciously understanding why, they subtly shift toward deeper emotional openness, subconscious introspection, or authentic honesty, all quietly influenced by your subtle psychological pause. The psychological brilliance of delayed response lies precisely in its quiet subtlety and gentle unpredictability. Immediate instinctive replies reassure subconscious minds, sustaining conversational rhythm and emotional harmony. Yet, subtle delays bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responses, and interpersonal dynamics. Individuals subjected to delayed replies rarely detect overt manipulation, perceiving you instead as naturally thoughtful, subtly discerning, and quietly intriguing, internally striving to emotionally engage your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during a professional interaction, such as an important negotiation or interview. Someone confidently asks a crucial question, expecting immediate clarification or affirmation. Instead, you gently pause before responding, quietly allowing a brief moment of silence to subtly permeate the conversation. Instantly, the other person's subconscious registers your subtle hesitation, internally compelled toward emotional openness, introspection, or subconscious uncertainty. Without consciously realizing why, they subconsciously seek emotional engagement, cooperation, or emotional resolution, subtly shifting interpersonal dynamics in your favor, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor delayed response. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, delayed response genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and genuine emotional connection. By occasionally introducing strategic pauses, conversations shift from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional depth, subconscious curiosity, and genuine introspection. Your subtle pauses quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious vulnerability, and authentic interpersonal openness, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally resonant exchanges. Furthermore, delayed response subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who occasionally pause thoughtfully, demonstrating subtle discernment, emotional control, and psychological awareness. Over time, your quiet mastery of delayed responses fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Delayed response represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for validation, emotional clarity, and conversational rhythm. By skillfully and strategically delaying replies, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional engagement, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Misplaced familiarity. Misplaced familiarity is a uniquely powerful psychological trick that quietly leverages subtle suggestions of existing familiarity to swiftly establish emotional rapport, create subconscious connection, and influence interactions. Rather than approaching someone with typical introductory formality or emotional neutrality, this method involves speaking warmly, comfortably, and confidently, as though you've previously established a close relationship, even when none actually exists. While seemingly simple or harmless, subtly introducing misplaced familiarity profoundly influences subconscious perceptions, emotional responses, and interpersonal openness. Why does something as subtle as assuming pre-existing familiarity hold extraordinary psychological power? Human beings naturally respond to emotional warmth, subconscious validation, and interpersonal closeness. When someone speaks as though a relationship already exists, using gentle warmth, casual language, and relaxed confidence, the subconscious mind instinctively interprets it as emotional openness, genuine friendship, or subtle closeness. Internally, unsettled by your warm familiarity, individuals subconsciously question themselves, quietly wondering whether they somehow forgot past interactions or unintentionally overlooked emotional connections. Quietly compelled towards subconscious acceptance, emotional openness, or genuine warmth, people naturally respond to your subtle psychological cues, subtly reshaping interpersonal dynamics. Imagine you're attending a social gathering where you encounter someone you've never met before. Rather than introducing yourself formally or neutrally, you gently employ misplaced familiarity, warmly approaching and softly saying, "It's great to see you again. How have things been going?" Immediately, their subconscious mind registers subtle uncertainty and internal confusion, internally questioning themselves. Did we meet previously? Have I forgotten our connection? They instinctively default towards subtle warmth, emotional openness, and subconscious responsiveness, attempting to subtly resolve internal uncertainty. Without realizing it, they've shifted emotionally from neutral strangers to psychologically receptive, emotionally open individuals, all quietly influenced by your subtle psychological suggestion. The quiet brilliance of misplaced familiarity lies precisely in its psychological subtlety and emotional authenticity. Overt attempts at emotional manipulation or interpersonal closeness typically trigger defensiveness, suspicion, or emotional resistance. However, subtle suggestions of existing familiarity bypass these conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal openness. Those subjected to misplaced familiarity rarely detect conscious manipulation, perceiving you instead as naturally warm, emotionally open, and genuinely charismatic, internally drawn towards subconscious connection with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as networking events or client meetings. Rather than maintaining emotional neutrality or formal introductions, you subtly approach with misplaced familiarity, softly remarking, "Hey, it's been a while. How's everything been?" Instantly, the other person's subconscious registers your warm confidence, quietly feeling subtle internal uncertainty and subconscious curiosity. Internally compelled toward emotional warmth, interpersonal openness, or subconscious responsiveness, individuals instinctively respond positively, subtly reshaping interactions in your favor, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your subtle psychological suggestion. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, misplaced familiarity genuinely enriches interpersonal exchanges, fostering deeper emotional warmth, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By gently suggesting emotional closeness or existing relationships, interactions shift from neutral superficiality into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious intrigue, and genuine emotional connection. Your subtle warmth quietly invites others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious openness, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, misplaced familiarity subtly enhances perceptions of your emotional charisma, interpersonal skill, and psychological depth. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project warmth, emotional openness, and subtle confidence. Over time, your quiet mastery of emotional familiarity fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Misplaced familiarity represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional connection, interpersonal warmth, and subconscious acceptance. By skillfully suggesting pre-existing familiarity, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal responsiveness, transforming ordinary interactions into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. The quiet whisper. The quiet whisper is a remarkably subtle psychological trick that quietly harnesses the power of lowered volume and softened speech to captivate attention, influence emotions, and subtly command interactions. Unlike typical conversational tones, which maintain steady volume and consistent projection, this approach involves deliberately lowering your voice into a soft, gentle whisper at crucial moments during conversations. While seeming minor or insignificant initially, this small vocal shift carries extraordinary psychological power, compelling subconscious engagement, emotional intimacy, and interpersonal responsiveness. Why does something as subtle as speaking softly or whispering have such profound psychological influence? Human beings instinctively associate quiet, soft tones with emotional intimacy, secretiveness, or subconscious significance. When someone lowers their voice into a gentle whisper, subconscious minds immediately interpret it as confidential, emotionally meaningful, or quietly important. Internally unsettled by subtle vocal shifts, individuals instinctively lean closer, physically and psychologically, compelled toward deeper emotional engagement, attentiveness, or subconscious openness. Quiet whispers naturally create subconscious curiosity, emotional intimacy, and interpersonal responsiveness, silently reshaping subconscious perceptions and interactions. Imagine you're conversing casually with a friend or colleague, sharing stories or discussing ordinary topics at normal conversational volume. Then, deliberately employing the quiet whisper, you softly lower your voice dramatically, gently saying something quietly important or subtly intriguing, perhaps sharing a seemingly confidential thought. Actually, there's something interesting I've been meaning to tell you. Instantly, their subconscious mind registers your subtle vocal shift, quietly feeling subtle internal curiosity, emotional intimacy, or subconscious intrigue. Internally compelled by instinctive anticipation, they subtly lean closer, emotionally engage, and subconsciously eager to hear your whispered words clearly. Without realizing it, they've subconsciously shifted from neutral listeners into deeply attentive, emotionally open participants, gently influenced by your subtle psychological cue. The extraordinary subtlety and psychological brilliance of the quiet whisper lie precisely in its gentle unpredictability and emotional resonance. Loud or steady tones typically maintain conversational rhythm and emotional neutrality, subconsciously reassuring individuals without provoking heightened engagement. Conversely, deliberate whispers bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional openness, and interpersonal responsiveness. Those subjected to subtle whispers rarely perceive overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally intriguing, emotionally intimate, and quietly captivating, internally striving toward emotional connection and subconscious attentiveness with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as presentations, negotiations, or important meetings. Initially maintaining steady conversational volume, you deliberately employ the quiet whisper at crucial moments, gently lowering your voice to softly emphasize key points, confidential insights, or subtle emotional significance. Instantly, your listeners subconsciously register your vocal shift, internally compelled toward heightened emotional attention, subconscious openness, and interpersonal engagement. Without consciously realizing why, they subtly shift toward cooperative responsiveness, emotional alignment, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor vocal adjustment. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, the quiet whisper genuinely enriches interpersonal exchanges, fostering deeper emotional intimacy, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally lowering your voice into gentle whispers, conversations shift from superficial routine into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal bonding. Your subtle whispers quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious intimacy, and authentic interpersonal openness, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, the quiet whisper subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional intimacy, quiet confidence, and subtle charisma. Over time, your quiet mastery of gentle whispers fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. The quiet whisper represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional intimacy, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious engagement. By skillfully lowering your voice into gentle whispers at crucial conversational moments, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Empty praise. Empty praise is an intriguingly subtle psychological trick, delicately crafted from deliberately vague compliments and ambiguous approval. Unlike typical praise, which specifically highlights known strengths or clear accomplishments, this method involves offering generalized, non-specific compliments that quietly stir subconscious curiosity, emotional engagement, and an intriguing sense of uncertainty. While initially seeming harmless or even positive, empty praise deeply unsettles subconscious minds, subtly compelling individuals toward introspection, emotional openness, and subconscious efforts to live up to your quiet approval. Why does something as seemingly innocuous as vague praise carry extraordinary psychological influence? Human beings instinctively seek clear validation, emotional affirmation, and interpersonal approval. When praised specifically and explicitly, individuals subconsciously understand exactly what earned recognition, emotionally satisfied by clarity. However, vague, non-specific praise subtly disrupts subconscious expectations, quietly creating internal curiosity, emotional uncertainty, and psychological tension. Internally unsettled, individuals instinctively feel compelled to subconsciously analyze themselves, quietly wondering what exactly prompted praise, subtly adjusting behaviors, emotions, or attitudes to justify your gentle yet ambiguous approval. Imagine a casual interaction where a friend or colleague confidently presents an idea, shares their opinion, or performs an ordinary task. Instead of clearly and specifically acknowledging their effort, you gently employ empty praise, softly offering a vague yet intriguing compliment. You know, there's something really special about the way you handle things. Initially pleased, yet internally uncertain, their subconscious mind quietly wonders, what specifically earned your recognition? Which aspect of their approach is special? Quietly compelled towards subconscious introspection, emotional curiosity, or subtle behavioral adjustment, they instinctively seek your approval, striving internally to embody whatever subtle quality you ambiguously praised. The psychological brilliance and quiet subtlety of empty praise lie precisely in its gentle ambiguity and emotional intrigue. Overt, specific compliments typically provide emotional satisfaction and subconscious closure, clearly identifying reasons for praise. Conversely, deliberately vague praise bypasses conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Individuals subjected to non-specific compliments rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally thoughtful, emotionally perceptive, and subtly intriguing, internally motivated toward emotional engagement and subconscious approval from your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as performance reviews, meetings, or team interactions. Rather than offering explicitly detailed feedback or specific acknowledgement, you subtly employ empty praise, gently remarking something like, "I appreciate how you always bring something unique to discussions." Initially pleased, yet internally uncertain, their subconscious mind quietly seeks clarification, internally compelled toward emotional openness, introspection, or subconscious behavioral adjustments. Without consciously realizing why, individuals subtly strive toward embodying your ambiguous praise, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your gentle psychological suggestion. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, empty praise genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally offering generalized compliments, conversations shift from superficial exchanges into quietly intriguing psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle praise quietly invites others into deeper emotional awareness, subconscious introspection, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, empty praise subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional perceptiveness, subtle discernment, and quiet charisma. Over time, your gentle mastery of ambiguous praise fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Empty praise represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional affirmation, interpersonal approval, and subconscious validation. By skillfully employing deliberately vague compliments and ambiguous praise, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary interactions into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Unpredictable pace. Unpredictable pace is an exceptionally subtle psychological trick that artfully leverages sudden changes in the speed and rhythm of your speech to captivate subconscious attention, subtly influence emotions, and quietly command interactions. Unlike typical conversational pacing, which maintains steady speed, predictable rhythm, and consistent emotional flow, this method involves deliberately altering your speaking pace, shifting unexpectedly between slow, measured speech and faster, more animated expressions. Though initially appearing minor or trivial, these subtle pacing changes carry extraordinary psychological influence, quietly unsettling subconscious expectations, increasing emotional engagement, and compelling deeper psychological responsiveness. Why does something as seemingly innocuous as changing speech pace have such profound psychological power? Human beings naturally crave predictable conversational rhythm, emotional consistency, and subconscious comfort during interactions. When someone speaks steadily, listeners subconsciously relax, instinctively expecting emotional harmony, psychological predictability, and conversational ease. Yet, sudden pacing shifts subtly disrupt these subconscious expectations, quietly creating internal uncertainty, emotional curiosity, and psychological tension. Internally, unsettled by subtle unpredictability, listeners instinctively feel compelled toward deeper emotional engagement, subconscious attentiveness, or emotional responsiveness, quietly influenced by your subtle yet unpredictable speech rhythms. Imagine conversing casually with a friend or colleague, initially maintaining steady, calm speech while discussing ordinary topics. Then, deliberately employing unpredictable pace, you suddenly accelerate your speech unexpectedly, briefly adopting a faster, animated tone, perhaps sharing an exciting detail or intriguing observation. Instantly, their subconscious mind registers your subtle yet unexpected pacing shift, quietly feeling subtle internal curiosity, emotional alertness, or psychological anticipation. Internally compelled by subconscious uncertainty, they subtly lean closer, emotionally attentive, and subconsciously eager to understand your suddenly animated expression. Without consciously realizing it, they've subconsciously shifted from neutral listeners into emotionally engaged participants, subtly influenced by your gentle psychological cue. The extraordinary subtlety and psychological brilliance of unpredictable pace lie precisely in its gentle unpredictability and subconscious resonance. Steady, predictable speech typically maintains conversational harmony and emotional neutrality, subconsciously reassuring listeners without provoking heightened emotional engagement. Conversely, sudden pacing shifts bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to unpredictable pacing rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally intriguing, emotionally complex, and subtly captivating, internally striving toward emotional connection and subconscious engagement with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as presentations, negotiations, or important meetings. Initially maintaining calm, measured speech, you deliberately employ unpredictable pace at crucial moments, suddenly slowing down dramatically, emphasizing key points or critical insights with thoughtful, deliberate intensity. Instantly, listeners subconsciously register your vocal shift, internally compelled toward heightened emotional attention, subconscious openness, and interpersonal responsiveness. Without consciously understanding why, they subtly shift toward cooperative responsiveness, emotional alignment, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor vocal adjustments. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, unpredictable pace genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally introducing strategic pacing shifts, conversations transform from superficial routine into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle pacing changes quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious introspection, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, unpredictable pace subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional complexity, subtle discernment, and quiet charisma. Over time, your mastery of unpredictable speech rhythms fosters deeper, subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Unpredictable pace represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional engagement, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious attentiveness. By skillfully shifting between steady, measured speech and sudden changes in pace, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet, emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Nonverbal ownership. Nonverbal ownership is a powerful yet extraordinarily subtle psychological trick, employing seemingly innocent actions like gently rearranging someone's possessions, casually touching items, or quietly occupying more physical space to assert subconscious control, emotional influence, and interpersonal dominance. Unlike overt gestures or explicit claims of ownership, this method operates quietly beneath conscious awareness, silently signaling subconscious authority and control through subtle, nonverbal behaviors. Although initially appearing trivial or innocuous, these minor actions possess profound psychological influence, compelling subconscious respect, emotional responsiveness, and subtly reshaping interpersonal dynamics. Why does something as seemingly harmless as touching or subtly repositioning objects possess extraordinary psychological power? Human beings naturally interpret nonverbal actions and physical interactions as subconscious signals of authority, emotional confidence, or interpersonal dominance. When someone subtly adjusts, touches, or rearranges possessions, whether their own or someone else's, the subconscious mind instinctively perceives it as gentle yet confident assertion of emotional control or subtle ownership. Internally, unsettled by these quiet gestures, individuals instinctively feel compelled towards subconscious cooperation, emotional respect, or subtle submission, silently reshaping interpersonal dynamics in your favor. Imagine you're engaged in a casual interaction, perhaps a friendly conversation at a cafe table, desk, or common area. Rather than passively interacting, you gently employ nonverbal ownership. Subtly yet deliberately, you gently reposition a coffee cup, casually touch a shared object, or quietly rearrange something on the table without overtly acknowledging it. Instantly, the other person's subconscious registers your subtle nonverbal action, quietly interpreting it as gentle authority, emotional confidence, or subconscious dominance. Internally unsettled by subtle signals of control, individuals instinctively adjust their emotional attitudes, subconsciously granting you subtle respect, emotional openness, or interpersonal influence, all quietly influenced by your gentle, psychological action. The psychological brilliance and quiet subtlety of nonverbal ownership lie precisely in its emotional ambiguity and subconscious resonance. Overt claims of ownership or explicit assertions of dominance typically trigger defensiveness, resistance, or emotional hostility. Conversely, subtle, nonverbal gestures bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to subtle rearrangements rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally confident, quietly assertive, and emotionally authoritative, internally striving towards subconscious cooperation and emotional respect with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, perhaps meetings, negotiations, or collaborative discussions. Rather than maintaining neutral emotional distance or passive engagement, you gently employ nonverbal ownership, casually leaning forward slightly, subtly moving documents closer to your space, or gently repositioning shared items without overtly acknowledging actions. Instantly, your conversational partners subconsciously register your subtle nonverbal signals, internally compelled toward emotional openness, subconscious cooperation, or interpersonal respect. Without consciously realizing why, they subtly shift toward cooperative responsiveness, emotional alignment, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor nonverbal actions. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, nonverbal ownership genuinely enriches interpersonal exchanges, fostering deeper emotional awareness, subconscious connection, and authentic interpersonal dynamics. By occasionally asserting subtle emotional control through gentle physical actions, interactions shift from superficial routine into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle gestures quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious attentiveness, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, nonverbal ownership subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological authority, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project subtle confidence, quiet emotional control, and interpersonal influence. Over time, your mastery of gentle nonverbal gestures fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Nonverbal ownership represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional respect, interpersonal cooperation, and subconscious submission. By skillfully employing subtle nonverbal actions such as gently rearranging possessions or quietly asserting physical space, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary interactions into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Circular statements. Circular statements are a remarkably subtle yet profoundly captivating psychological trick, artfully employing statements or explanations that loop back upon themselves without clearly resolving. Unlike direct communication, which seeks straightforward clarity and emotional resolution, this method deliberately presents ideas in self-referential loops or gently repetitive cycles, quietly creating subconscious uncertainty, emotional curiosity, and psychological engagement. Though initially appearing harmless or casual, these subtle circular statements deeply captivate subconscious attention, quietly compelling emotional introspection, subtle confusion, and interpersonal responsiveness. Why does something as seemingly minor as employing circular statements possess extraordinary psychological power? Human beings naturally crave clarity, emotional resolution, and subconscious coherence during interactions. When someone communicates clearly and straightforwardly, listeners subconsciously relax, instinctively expecting emotional closure, psychological clarity, and conversational predictability. Conversely, gently repetitive or self-referential statements subtly disrupt these subconscious expectations, quietly creating internal curiosity, emotional uncertainty, and psychological tension. Internally unsettled by subtle ambiguity or quiet contradiction, listeners instinctively feel compelled towards subconscious introspection, emotional openness, or deeper psychological engagement, quietly influenced by your subtle yet intriguing conversational loops. Imagine engaging casually with a friend or colleague, perhaps discussing a decision, idea, or personal opinion. Rather than clearly stating your position or providing direct explanations, you gently employ circular statements, softly saying something subtly self-referential or looping, "I believe it's important because the reason it's important is precisely what makes it matter." Initially seeming innocent or casual, your gently circular statement instantly unsettles subconscious expectations. Internally uncertain yet emotionally intrigued, their subconscious mind quietly seeks clarity, compelled toward deeper emotional introspection, subconscious curiosity, or subtle psychological engagement. Without consciously realizing why, they've subconsciously shifted from neutral listeners into deeply attentive participants, gently influenced by your subtle psychological loop. The extraordinary subtlety and psychological brilliance of circular statements lie precisely in their gentle ambiguity and subconscious resonance. Clear, direct explanations typically provide emotional resolution and subconscious comfort, clearly identifying reasons or logical connections. Conversely, subtle circular loops bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to circular statements rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally intriguing, emotionally complex, and quietly captivating, internally striving toward emotional understanding and subconscious engagement with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as negotiations, meetings, or collaborative discussions. Rather than offering explicitly direct explanations or linear justifications, you subtly employ circular statements, gently remarking something subtly self-referential. We should focus on this aspect because focusing on this aspect is precisely why it's valuable. Instantly, your listeners subconsciously register your gentle circularity, internally compelled toward heightened emotional attention, subconscious openness, or interpersonal responsiveness. Without consciously understanding why, individuals subtly shift toward cooperative responsiveness, emotional alignment, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor conversational loops. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, circular statements genuinely enrich interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally introducing subtle circularity or gentle ambiguity, conversations shift from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle loops quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious introspection, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, circular statements subtly enhance perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional complexity, subtle discernment, and quiet charisma. Over time, your mastery of gentle conversational loops fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Circular statements represent extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional engagement, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious curiosity. By skillfully employing gently repetitive or self-referential statements, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. The Phantom Agreement. The Phantom Agreement is a remarkably subtle yet deeply compelling psychological trick, masterfully employing gentle nods, subtle gestures, and quiet affirmations during conversation, even when genuine agreement hasn't been explicitly stated, to silently foster subconscious alignment, emotional openness, and interpersonal receptivity. Unlike clear verbal agreements or overt expressions of consent, this approach operates quietly beneath conscious awareness, softly signaling subconscious validation and subtle emotional concurrence through understated nonverbal cues. Although initially appearing minor or innocuous, these quiet gestures carry profound psychological influence, subtly shaping subconscious perceptions, emotional responses, and interpersonal dynamics. Why does something as seemingly subtle as nodding gently or subtly, affirming through gestures, possess extraordinary psychological power? Human beings naturally interpret nonverbal gestures, emotional signals, and subtle affirmations as subconscious indicators of agreement, emotional alignment, or interpersonal harmony. When someone softly nods or gently gestures affirmatively, even without explicit verbal consent, the subconscious mind instinctively perceives it as quiet validation, emotional reassurance, or subtle interpersonal concurrence. Internally comforted by these gentle affirmations, individuals subconsciously relax emotional defenses, instinctively shifting toward deeper emotional openness, subconscious alignment, or genuine interpersonal cooperation, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological cue. Imagine you're engaging casually with a friend or colleague who is passionately explaining their perspective, confidently stating opinions, or advocating their viewpoint. Instead of openly expressing verbal agreement, you gently employ the phantom agreement, softly nodding subtly and occasionally affirming quietly through subtle nonverbal gestures. Instantly, their subconscious mind registers your subtle affirmations, quietly interpreting them as emotional alignment, subconscious validation, or interpersonal harmony. Internally comforted yet subtly uncertain, since explicit verbal agreement hasn't occurred, they subconsciously strive toward deeper emotional openness, internal clarity, or cooperative responsiveness, subtly aligning themselves emotionally with your quiet nonverbal cues. The psychological brilliance and extraordinary subtlety of the phantom agreement lie precisely in its gentle ambiguity and emotional resonance. Clear verbal agreements typically provide emotional closure and subconscious reassurance, explicitly signaling interpersonal harmony. Conversely, subtle nonverbal gestures bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to phantom affirmations rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally supportive, emotionally aligned, and quietly affirming, internally motivated toward emotional openness and subconscious connection with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as negotiations, collaborative meetings, or critical discussions. Rather than explicitly stating agreement or openly advocating positions, you gently employ the phantom agreement, softly nodding subtly at crucial points, gently affirming with quiet gestures, or occasionally murmuring subtle sounds of understanding. Instantly, your conversational partners subconsciously register your subtle affirmations, internally compelled toward emotional openness, subconscious cooperation, or interpersonal alignment. Without consciously realizing why, they subtly shift toward cooperative responsiveness, emotional harmony, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor nonverbal cues. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, the phantom agreement genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional resonance, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally employing gentle nods or subtle affirmations, conversations shift from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional warmth, subconscious harmony, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle gestures quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious alignment, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, the phantom agreement subtly enhances perceptions of your emotional intelligence, interpersonal sensitivity, and psychological charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional warmth, subtle discernment, and quiet empathy. Over time, your mastery of subtle nonverbal affirmations fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Ultimately, the phantom agreement represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional harmony, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious validation. By skillfully employing subtle nods, gentle gestures, or quiet affirmations, even without explicit verbal agreement, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet, emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Anchored confusion. Anchored confusion is a fascinatingly subtle psychological trick, quietly employing deliberate ambiguity, gentle paradoxes, or softly contradictory information to create mild cognitive uncertainty and subconscious engagement. Unlike straightforward communication, which naturally seeks clarity, emotional harmony, and predictable resolution, this approach intentionally introduces carefully controlled confusion or subtle contradictions anchored to otherwise clear statements, quietly compelling deeper psychological engagement, emotional openness, and subconscious introspection. Why does something as seemingly counterintuitive as introducing confusion possess extraordinary psychological power? Human beings instinctively crave emotional clarity, cognitive coherence, and subconscious comfort during interactions. When communication remains clear, straightforward, and logically consistent, listeners subconsciously relax, instinctively expecting emotional ease, predictable conclusions, and psychological harmony. Conversely, deliberately anchored confusion subtly disrupts these subconscious expectations, quietly creating internal uncertainty, emotional curiosity, and subtle psychological tension. Internally unsettled by mild cognitive paradoxes or gentle contradictions, individuals instinctively feel compelled toward deeper emotional engagement, subconscious introspection, or cooperative responsiveness, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological strategy. Imagine engaging casually with a friend or colleague, discussing an ordinary decision, idea, or perspective. Rather than providing a straightforward opinion or clear advice, you gently employ anchored confusion, softly remarking something paradoxically subtle. The simplest way to approach this might also be the most complicated. Initially appearing harmless, yet internally intriguing, your gentle contradiction instantly unsettles subconscious expectations. Internally uncertain yet emotionally curious, their subconscious mind quietly seeks clarity, subtly compelled toward deeper introspection, emotional openness, or subconscious engagement. Without consciously realizing why, they've shifted from neutral listeners into deeply attentive participants, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological paradox. The psychological brilliance and extraordinary subtlety of anchored confusion lie precisely in its gentle ambiguity and subconscious resonance. Clear explanations or logical consistency typically provide emotional reassurance and subconscious resolution, clearly identifying logical connections or emotional conclusions. Conversely, deliberate paradoxes or subtle contradictions bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to anchored confusion rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally insightful, emotionally complex, and subtly intriguing, internally motivated toward emotional connection and subconscious understanding with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as collaborative discussions, negotiations, or team interactions. Rather than explicitly offering direct recommendations or clear explanations, you subtly employ anchored confusion, gently stating something softly contradictory or paradoxical. What makes this strategy effective might also be what makes it challenging. Instantly, listeners subconsciously register your gentle contradiction, internally compelled toward heightened emotional attention, subconscious openness, or interpersonal responsiveness. Without consciously understanding why, individuals subtly shift toward cooperative responsiveness, emotional alignment, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor cognitive paradox. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, anchored confusion genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally introducing subtle paradoxes or gentle contradictions anchored to otherwise clear statements, conversations transform from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle cognitive paradoxes quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious introspection, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, anchored confusion subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional complexity, subtle discernment, and quiet charisma. Over time, your mastery of gentle cognitive paradoxes fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Anchored confusion represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional engagement, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious introspection. By skillfully employing deliberate ambiguity, gentle paradoxes, or subtle contradictions anchored to clear statements, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Conscious forgetting. Conscious forgetting is an exceptionally subtle psychological trick that masterfully employs deliberate moments of mild forgetfulness to subtly influence interpersonal interactions, emotional perceptions, and subconscious dynamics. Unlike ordinary memory lapses, which occur naturally and inadvertently, this method involves intentionally forgetting minor details, names, or specifics within conversations, gently creating subconscious uncertainty, emotional engagement, and subtle introspection in others. Although initially appearing innocent or trivial, these quiet moments of conscious forgetfulness possess profound psychological power, subtly reshaping interpersonal relationships, emotional responsiveness, and subconscious perceptions. Why does something as seemingly minor as deliberately forgetting small details possess extraordinary psychological influence? Human beings instinctively seek emotional validation, interpersonal recognition, and subconscious affirmation during interactions. When someone clearly remembers specific details, such as names, events, or personal information, listeners subconsciously feel emotionally validated, interpersonally recognized, and psychologically secure. Conversely, deliberate, subtle forgetfulness gently disrupts these subconscious expectations, quietly creating internal uncertainty, emotional curiosity, and psychological tension. Internally, unsettled by subtle emotional ambiguity or quiet uncertainty, individuals instinctively feel compelled toward deeper emotional openness, subconscious introspection, or interpersonal responsiveness, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological strategy. Imagine engaging casually with a friend or colleague, discussing recent events, shared experiences, or personal stories. Rather than clearly recalling all specific details, you gently employ conscious forgetting, softly pausing and quietly remarking, "I'm sorry, can you remind me again how you were involved?" Instantly, their subconscious mind registers your subtle forgetfulness, quietly feeling internal curiosity, emotional uncertainty, or subconscious introspection, internally compelled toward deeper emotional openness, interpersonal responsiveness, or subconscious connection. They instinctively strive toward clarifying details, reaffirming memories, or re-establishing emotional recognition. Without consciously realizing why, they've subtly shifted from neutral listeners into emotionally engaged participants, quietly influenced by your gentle psychological cue. The psychological brilliance and extraordinary subtlety of conscious forgetting lie precisely in its gentle ambiguity and subconscious resonance. Clear recall or precise memory typically provides emotional reassurance and subconscious validation, explicitly signaling interpersonal recognition or emotional importance. Conversely, subtle, deliberate forgetfulness bypasses conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to conscious forgetting rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally genuine, emotionally authentic, and subtly relatable, internally motivated toward emotional openness and subconscious connection with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as meetings, networking events, or team collaborations. Rather than explicitly recalling every detail, you subtly employ conscious forgetting, gently saying something like, "Remind me again, did we discuss this in detail before?" Instantly, conversational partners subconsciously register your subtle forgetfulness, internally compelled toward emotional openness, subconscious cooperation, or interpersonal responsiveness. Without consciously understanding why, individuals subtly shift toward cooperative responsiveness, emotional alignment, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor cognitive lapse. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, conscious forgetting genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally introducing gentle forgetfulness or subtle uncertainty, conversations shift from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle forgetfulness quietly invites others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious introspection, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, conscious forgetting subtly enhances perceptions of your emotional authenticity, interpersonal warmth, and psychological relatability. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional genuineness, subtle humility, and quiet relatability. Over time, your mastery of gentle forgetfulness fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Conscious forgetting represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional recognition, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious introspection. By skillfully employing deliberate moments of subtle forgetfulness, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet, emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Shadow questioning. Shadow questioning is a remarkably subtle psychological trick, delicately employing vague, indirect, or reflective questions to quietly unsettle subconscious assumptions, emotional comfort, and interpersonal expectations. Unlike clear, direct questioning, which explicitly seeks information or immediate responses, this method gently introduces ambiguous, open-ended, or subtly reflective inquiries, softly prompting subconscious introspection, emotional uncertainty, and deeper psychological engagement. Although initially seeming harmless or casual, these quiet shadow questions profoundly influence subconscious dynamics, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal connections. Why does something as seemingly minor as subtly reflective, or ambiguous questioning possess extraordinary psychological power. Human beings instinctively seek emotional clarity, cognitive certainty, and subconscious comfort during interactions. When questions are straightforward, explicitly direct, or emotionally predictable, individuals subconsciously feel secure, instinctively providing immediate answers, emotional defenses, or subconscious closure. Conversely, deliberately vague, reflective, or open-ended shadow questions quietly disrupt these subconscious expectations, subtly creating internal uncertainty, emotional curiosity, and gentle psychological tension. Internally unsettled by subtle emotional ambiguity or quiet introspection, listeners instinctively feel compelled toward deeper emotional openness, subconscious reflection, or cooperative responsiveness, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological strategy. Imagine engaging casually with a friend or colleague discussing their recent choices, opinions, or personal beliefs. Rather than explicitly challenging their perspectives or clearly seeking direct explanations, you gently employ shadow questioning, softly asking something subtly ambiguous or reflective. Have you ever wondered why you chose that particular path? Initially seeming innocent or casually curious, your quiet question instantly unsettles subconscious expectations. Internally uncertain yet emotionally intrigued, their subconscious mind quietly seeks clarity, subtly compelled toward deeper introspection, emotional openness, or subconscious engagement. Without consciously realizing why, they've subtly shifted from neutral listeners into deeply reflective participants, quietly influenced by your gentle psychological prompt. The extraordinary subtlety and psychological brilliance of shadow questioning lie precisely in its gentle ambiguity and subconscious resonance. Clear, direct questions typically prompt immediate answers and emotional defenses, explicitly signaling interpersonal expectations or cognitive clarity. Conversely, deliberately vague or reflective inquiries bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to shadow questions rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally thoughtful, emotionally insightful, and quietly intriguing, internally motivated toward emotional openness and subconscious connection with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as performance reviews, team discussions, or critical conversations. Rather than explicitly seeking direct explanations or clear justifications, you subtly employ shadow questioning, gently remarking something quietly reflective. Do you ever think there might be something we're overlooking here? Instantly, conversational partners subconsciously register your gentle ambiguity, internally compelled toward emotional openness, subconscious introspection, or cooperative responsiveness. Without consciously understanding why, individuals subtly shift toward cooperative alignment, emotional engagement, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor, reflective question. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, shadow questioning genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional introspection, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally introducing gentle ambiguity, reflective uncertainty, or subtle open-ended questions, conversations shift from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious curiosity, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle, reflective questions quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious introspection, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, shadow questioning subtly enhances perceptions of your psychological depth, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional insightfulness, subtle discernment, and quiet charisma. Over time, your mastery of gentle, reflective questioning fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Shadow questioning represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional engagement, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious introspection. By skillfully employing subtly reflective, ambiguous, or open-ended questions, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Silent permission. Silent permission is an exceptionally subtle yet deeply compelling psychological trick, quietly employing gentle nods, subtle gestures, or intentional pauses to grant implicit approval without explicit verbal acknowledgement. Unlike direct permission or overt statements of approval, this method operates quietly beneath conscious awareness, softly signaling subconscious consent, emotional reassurance, and interpersonal encouragement through understated nonverbal cues. Although initially seeming minor or inconsequential, these quiet gestures carry profound psychological influence, subtly shaping subconscious perceptions, emotional responses, and interpersonal dynamics. Why does something as seemingly trivial as subtly granting permission through silence possess extraordinary psychological power? Human beings instinctively interpret subtle nonverbal gestures, gentle affirmations, and quiet pauses as subconscious indicators of acceptance, emotional approval, or interpersonal reassurance. When someone softly nods, subtly smiles, or quietly pauses thoughtfully, even without explicit verbal confirmation, the subconscious mind instinctively perceives it as quiet validation, emotional support, or implicit permission. Internally comforted by these gentle affirmations, individuals subconsciously relax emotional defenses, instinctively shifting toward deeper emotional openness, subconscious alignment, or genuine interpersonal cooperation, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological presence. Imagine engaging casually with a friend or colleague who seems hesitant about sharing an idea, expressing a vulnerable thought, or making a personal decision. Rather than explicitly prompting or overtly encouraging them, you gently employ silent permission, softly nodding subtly, gently smiling warmly, or quietly waiting with supportive silence. Instantly, their subconscious mind registers your subtle affirmations, quietly interpreting them as emotional acceptance, subconscious validation, or interpersonal support. Internally comforted, yet subtly uncertain, since explicit verbal approval hasn't occurred, they subconsciously strive toward deeper emotional openness, internal clarity, or cooperative responsiveness, subtly aligning themselves emotionally with your quiet, nonverbal cues. The psychological brilliance and extraordinary subtlety of silent permission lie precisely in its gentle ambiguity and emotional resonance. Clear verbal confirmations or explicit approvals typically provide emotional closure and subconscious reassurance, explicitly signaling interpersonal harmony or emotional acceptance. Conversely, subtle nonverbal cues or quiet affirmations bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responsiveness, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to silent permissions rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally supportive, emotionally aligned, and quietly reassuring, internally motivated toward emotional openness and subconscious connection with your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as team meetings, collaborative discussions, or critical conversations. Rather than explicitly stating approval or openly encouraging ideas, you gently employ silent permission, softly nodding thoughtfully, subtly leaning forward attentively, or quietly offering supportive silence. Instantly, conversational partners subconsciously register your subtle affirmations, internally compelled toward emotional openness, subconscious cooperation, or interpersonal responsiveness. Without consciously understanding why, individuals subtly shift toward cooperative alignment, emotional engagement, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor nonverbal cues. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, silent permission genuinely enriches interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional resonance, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally employing gentle nods, subtle gestures, or supportive pauses, conversations shift from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional warmth, subconscious harmony, and genuine interpersonal openness. Your subtle nonverbal cues quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious alignment, and authentic interpersonal bonding, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, silent permission subtly enhances perceptions of your emotional intelligence, interpersonal sensitivity, and psychological charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional warmth, subtle discernment, and quiet empathy. Over time, your mastery of subtle nonverbal affirmations fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional warmth, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Ultimately, silent permission represents extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional acceptance, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious validation. By skillfully employing subtle nods, gentle gestures, or quiet affirmations, even without explicit verbal confirmation, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary conversations into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence. Invisible boundaries. Invisible boundaries is an intriguingly subtle psychological trick that masterfully utilizes the quiet arrangement of physical space, personal items, or subtle body positioning to establish subconscious zones of influence, emotional authority, and interpersonal control. Unlike explicit declarations or overt gestures signaling boundaries, this method gently creates subtle, unseen barriers through carefully positioned belongings, unspoken spatial arrangements, or intentional postures, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional comfort, and interpersonal dynamics. Although initially appearing trivial or innocuous, these gentle acts carry profound psychological power, silently reshaping interactions and commanding subtle emotional respect. Why does something as seemingly minor as quietly positioning personal objects or subtly managing space possess extraordinary psychological influence? Human beings instinctively interpret spatial arrangements, personal items, and physical positioning as subconscious signals of emotional authority, interpersonal boundaries, or psychological dominance. When someone subtly places belongings around their area or quietly adjusts their position, even without explicitly declaring boundaries, the subconscious mind instinctively perceives it as gentle yet firm emotional assertion, quiet authority, or subtle dominance. Internally recognizing these quiet spatial cues, individuals subconsciously adjust emotional behavior, instinctively respecting invisible boundaries, subtly altering emotional openness or interpersonal responsiveness, quietly influenced by your subtle psychological arrangement. Imagine engaging casually with a friend or colleague at a shared table or workspace. Rather than explicitly stating your need for personal space or openly indicating boundaries, you gently employ invisible boundaries, quietly positioning a notebook, coffee mug, or other personal items subtly around your area, creating an implicit yet unspoken boundary. Instantly, their subconscious mind registers your subtle spatial arrangement, quietly interpreting it as emotional respect, subconscious authority, or interpersonal control. Internally unsettled by subtle, invisible boundaries, individuals instinctively adjust their emotional attitudes, subconsciously respecting your subtle space, quietly maintaining emotional boundaries, or subtly altering interpersonal behavior without consciously realizing why. They've subtly shifted from neutral interaction into respectful emotional responsiveness, quietly influenced by your gentle psychological cues. The psychological brilliance and extraordinary subtlety of invisible boundaries lie precisely in their gentle ambiguity and subconscious resonance. Clear verbal statements or explicit boundary declarations typically provoke conscious awareness, emotional resistance, or defensive reactions. Conversely, subtle nonverbal spatial arrangements bypass conscious defenses, quietly influencing subconscious perceptions, emotional responses, and interpersonal dynamics. Those subjected to invisible boundaries rarely detect overt manipulation, viewing you instead as naturally confident, emotionally authoritative, and subtly respectful, internally motivated toward emotional responsiveness and subconscious respect for your subtle psychological presence. Consider another scenario during professional interactions, such as meetings, collaborative projects, or important negotiations. Rather than explicitly declaring your authority or openly demanding respect, you gently employ invisible boundaries, quietly yet deliberately arranging documents, devices, or personal belongings around your workspace, subtly claiming unspoken territory. Instantly, conversational partners subconsciously register your gentle spatial signals, internally compelled toward emotional respect, subconscious cooperation, or interpersonal responsiveness. Without consciously understanding why, individuals subtly shift toward cooperative alignment, emotional engagement, or subconscious receptivity, quietly yet profoundly influenced by your seemingly minor spatial arrangements. Yet, beyond mere psychological influence, invisible boundaries genuinely enrich interpersonal interactions, fostering deeper emotional respect, authenticity, and subconscious connection. By occasionally employing subtle spatial arrangements or gentle positioning, interactions shift from superficial exchanges into quietly captivating psychological experiences filled with emotional resonance, subconscious harmony, and genuine interpersonal respect. Your subtle spatial cues quietly invite others into deeper emotional engagement, subconscious attentiveness, and authentic interpersonal respect, transforming ordinary interactions into emotionally meaningful exchanges. Furthermore, invisible boundaries subtly enhance perceptions of your psychological authority, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal charisma. Individuals instinctively respect and admire those who naturally project emotional confidence, subtle assertiveness, and quiet charisma. Over time, your mastery of gentle spatial management fosters deeper subconscious respect, emotional authority, and interpersonal influence, quietly enhancing your psychological presence, subtle charisma, and emotional authority. Invisible boundaries represent extraordinary psychological subtlety, quietly harnessing subconscious instincts for emotional respect, interpersonal responsiveness, and subconscious cooperation. By skillfully employing gentle spatial arrangements, subtle object placement, or quiet physical positioning, even without explicit verbal statements, you subtly yet decisively shift subconscious dynamics, emotional openness, and interpersonal influence, transforming ordinary interactions into psychologically profound exchanges filled with quiet, emotional resonance, genuine interpersonal connection, and subtle yet powerful psychological influence.